Okay, so in the next few minutes, we want to take a look at this step of analysis in terms of doing your criticism. And we've said that the first step of doing criticism, of course, is description. And description is, in essence, that characterization of what you are looking at. That characterization is important and it's valuable, but think of your description as a picture. Okay, it's an image. It is a view of the outside of your artifact. It's what's there. Where is it? Who did it? When was it? How did it get there? That's the sort of stuff that comes up in description. Description is, think of it this way, a picture. It's just a photograph. It's what you can see. It's what's on the surface. It's what's right there. All right. Analysis is different. All right. Analysis looks at the parts and pieces that make that thing work. So analysis is more like a blueprint. So if we think of description as a photograph of the thing, you should begin thinking of analysis as a blueprint of what's inside that thing. How does this work? What makes it function? Okay. So we've got description. Here's what's there. Analysis is the nuts and bolts. This is how it works. This is what makes it function. Later, in evaluation and interpretation, we'll pick up this idea and we'll talk a little bit more about why those design choices were made. Okay, so the things we find inside our artifact, the blueprint stuff, we're going to later pick that up and we're going to use that to say, okay, later we will reflect on, okay, why were those choices made? And that's what we will use, that question. Why were these design choices made inside my artifact? That is the question that we will use to draw out our judgments, to make reasonable conclusions. And in fact, when your textbook talks about evaluation and interpretation, they mean the reasonable conclusions you're going to draw about this message. The thing that in the lessons on criticism, we said, remember, you're going to make a judgment. This is the judgment. The judgment you're going to make will be a reasonable conclusion, or maybe two or three reasonable conclusions that you're going to draw together. That's your evaluation and your interpretation, and that will come later. Right now, analysis. Analysis is a blueprint. It's a map of how your artifact works. Now, obviously, you can't do it all. It's too complicated. Your artifact is as complicated as a moon rocket, okay? Maybe even a little more complicated in the long run. So you can't do everything in there. So often what we do is we pick some aspect, some point or part of this, and we blow that up and we look at that one, we enlarge it and we look at it in much more depth and detail. So when you begin to think about analysis, you have to recognize you're not going to be analyzing your entire artifact. You're going to find some part of that artifact, some small aspect of that artifact, and you are going to bring that into focus. You're going to blow it up and you're going to talk about how those things work. Now, how do you go about that? Okay, what's the first step in terms of getting into analysis? Okay, the first step in getting into analysis is to go back to your description. Every single artifact is going to have a thesis, we call it. It's just simply that statement where the author, the rhetor, has said, here is what you audience, should move toward. Here's what you should embrace. Here's something you should agree with. That is what your thesis is. It's a statement about what you're supposed to move toward and embrace. Now, the thing about it is, that statement in and of itself is powerful, but obviously your rhetor is not going to just leave that hanging there, right? They aren't going to just simply leave you with a statement of what you ought to do. They're going to give you reasons why you should do it, right? And those reasons why you should do it, that's your main point. Those are the things that you look. Now, remember, here we're still talking about description. This is the end of your description. End of description, here's where the rhetor wants me to go. And guess what? They tell me, okay, here's a reason you should do that. Here's another reason you should do it. Wow, there's a third reason you ought to do it as well. And the rhetor will lay out a set of main points of reasons why it is a good idea for you to embrace the thesis. That's your basic structure. And that's where your description should end. Okay, so we're not to analysis yet. This is where your description should end. It should end with a statement about where the author wants you to go and a clear outline of the main points about about why you should go there. All right. Now, obviously, this isn't complete either, is it? I mean, the author is clearly, once they've laid out what their main points are, they don't just simply hang those in the air. They clearly have lots and lots of things to say about why that's a really good idea and why you should listen to me and all that sort of stuff. All of that we're going to look at in much more depth and detail. Okay, and as we get a little deeper into analysis, we'll talk about the yada, yada, yada things, right? The things that are going on under those main points. But your description as a whole ends right there. It ends with a statement about what it is this author, this writer, wants you to embrace, to move toward, and essentially statements about why that's a good idea. That's the basic structure of description. And it is right there that analysis begins. So if you want to figure out what to do with your analysis, if you want to figure out where to stop, where to start, what your first step is, go to the end of your description and figure out what the thesis is. Look at it long and hard, make sure you got it right, and then pick that thesis up and move forward with this question. What sort of rhetorical devices are present in this message? What are the rhetorical devices that are present here? When we pick up that idea, what are the rhetorical devices that are present here? We're going to say, okay, look, certain devices come into this message and they tell us the following. They tell us how this device, how does the device work? How do the devices interact with each other? That's what analysis is going to show us. What patterns are present in the message? Okay, so these are the things that analysis is going to begin picking up on. It's going to start with that thesis. Here's what the reader wants. And it's going to say, okay, what are the rhetorical devices they're using to help get me there? How do those devices work? How do those devices interact with each other? How do they repeat or set themselves in opposition to each other? What patterns am I going to see here as I unpack this message? Okay, how are you going to go through that? You're going to go through it by following 4 steps. So here is a sketch of how to do rhetorical analysis. Now, the analysis step has 4 steps to it. First of all, name that rhetorical device that's present. State the rhetorical device that is there. For example, repetition. We're going to talk about rhetorical devices more here in a second. Repetition is a pretty standard rhetorical advice where somebody says something and they say it a number of times, okay? So name it. Say, hey, I see repetition going on inside this artifact. Okay, once you've named that device, the second thing you do is you're going to go out and you're going to talk about how that device generally works. Now here you're going to have to do a little bit of background. You're going to have to do a little bit of digging. You're going to have to look some things up. What does repetition do? How does it work psychologically? How does it work in terms of moving an audience? Huh? Why do rhetors use repetition? Because they do all over the globe, everywhere, in virtually every culture. Repetition is a strong part of how people build rhetorical artifacts. Why? What is it that makes repetition generally, broadly work? Once we know what device is present and we know how it generally works, we go into that third step, and that's where you tell us how the device specifically works in your artifact. So we start out by saying, hey, here's repetition. I see repetition in my artifact because I see the following phrases being repeated. And then I say, well, it's interesting because repetition generally works to do the following things. Repetition increases a sense that this is important. Repetition increases a sense that there is urgency. Repetition can be used to increase memory so that something will be recalled in more depth later. Okay, so that's how repetition generally works. Now here's what's being repeated in my artifact. Oh, look, it's being repeated not immediately one time after another. I tell you, I tell you, I tell you. I'm getting the phrase I tell you 4 different times. to start off an idea in my artifact. Okay, wow, I bet that's being used to, okay, now we're getting somewhere. We have moved from naming a specific device to a discussion about how that kind of a device works, generally speaking. And now we're focused on the presence of that device in my artifact. I call attention to it and I talk about how it's working there. Now, what that does for me is, in the final analysis, I begin to say, okay, here's what doing that does to help my Redder get their audience over to that thesis. Those are your 4 steps. Name a rhetorical device. Tell how that rhetorical device generally works. Tell us how that rhetorical device is specifically working inside your artifact. 4, tell us how that rhetorical device working that way, functioning that way in your artifact is moving this audience toward that thesis. So we get increasingly specific, focused, and targeted as we move down. Name a device, define it, tell us how it usually works, tell us how it's specifically functioning in your artifact, tell us how that function is moving an audience toward the thesis. Because remember, the goal is to have an audience move toward a thesis. Have an audience say, okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. Okay, yeah, I'm willing to at least entertain that idea. Okay. Your analysis should show us that there are rhetorical devices here, and you're going to name them. You're going to show us how those rhetorical devices generally work. You're going to show us how they're specifically doing some heavy lifting inside your artifact, and you're going to say, and doing that moves the audience toward the thesis. Now, rhetorical devices, I've been throwing that word around a lot, right? And that raises some very obvious questions like, what's a rhetorical device, and where do I find them? Okay, since you're going to clearly be writing your analysis paper by naming rhetorical devices, you might want to try to figure out what rhetorical device is and how do you go out and find them? How do you locate them? That's a really excellent question, but it's a question, believe it or not, we've already answered. Look familiar? When we do criticism, we said, method is a process that guides the reasoning about my artifact, and it gives me data, it gives me information. Now, in the end, theory is going to guide my judgments, those evaluations that I'm going to make later, those reasonable conclusions I'm going to draw. That's going to be guided by theory, but we're not there yet. We'll talk about theory later, guiding our interpretation. Right now, we're looking at method, okay? And we're talking about how method guides the process of reasoning. So in analysis, you're going to find your rhetorical devices by using your method. That's what the method does. The method shows you the rhetorical devices. Now, if you remember when we were looking at this slide in an earlier presentation, we said, hey, look, the result of the method is that you're going to get data, you're going to get information, but that can be a little misleading. Okay, yeah, this is why it's misleading. Method is going to guide your process of thinking about your artifact. That is, method's going to guide your analysis. And the result is that data that you get, the information that comes from applying your method, that information, that data is a list of the rhetorical devices that are present here and how they're working together. That's what your method is going to do for you. So if you apply the method correctly, appropriately to your artifact, that is what will unlock the artifact. And that is what will show you what rhetorical devices are present. Apply your method. That will show you the devices. So what happens is our method will pick us up and will guide us. It will point us toward certain things that are present. We're going to see things that we had not seen before. We're going to notice patterns that had not appeared to us, that we hadn't noticed before. We're going to look and we're going to say, oh, wow, look at that. I didn't realize it, but here, look at that repetition. Oh, there it is again. Same thing right here, over and over again. Now suddenly, I've got a series of things that are happening over and over again. I didn't see that on my own, but I got my method working. And my method taught me how to ask the kinds of questions that highlighted those similarities. And so then I'm in a position where I can begin to say, oh, I see. This is how that's related. That's why this is being repeated. This is happening over and over because the pattern, if you look, the pattern gets more and more frequent, more and more intense toward the end. And that's what's helping to move us toward that thesis, that conclusion that the author wants us to draw. Apply your method, and you will learn about the rhetorical devices that are present in your artifact. That's a method's job. It's a filter, it's a lens that we hold up in front of us in order to better understand the rhetorical processes that are happening inside our artifact. That's the whole point and the whole goal of method. Method is the way to